Good day everyone! Welcome to our class. I am Teacher Johnny and today we will discuss about hyperpoetry. Our target for today is for you to understand the definition of hyperpoetry, to differentiate traditional poetry to hyperpoetry, and to create your own example of hyperpoetry. So now, let's begin with knowing the definition of hyper in poetry. So according to dictionary, hyper means beyond or over. So for example, the word hyperactive, which means you are more than active. And the word poetry, which is a literary form that formulates imaginative awareness of experience in language and expresses feelings, emotion that usually uses metaphoric words. So they are combined together. So which hyperpoetry probably means beyond a traditional poetry, and it compasses to what we think a normal poetry is. So now let's get to know the definition of hyperpoetry. Hyperpoetry is also known as the cyberpoetry. So what comes into our mind every time we hear the word cyber is it always involve the use of computer or computer networks such as internet. So hyperpoetry, it refers to the genre of poetry that is produced and presented with the use of computer. So without computer, hyperpoetry cannot be existed because it is found online and it only works on web. So as its name suggests, hyperpoetry involves line of verses that appear linked to footnotes, sub-poems, poetry generators, and also poetry with images or movement. So hyperpoetry, it is a digital form of poetry. It is a new genre of poetry that uses link of hypertext markup. So this hypertext makes it easy for the reader to move from one website to another because of the embedded links. So each link brings the reader to another page which expands their idea or knowledge presented by the text of the poem. So the poem moving or being generated in response to the link that they click or that the reader choose. It can either involve set of words, phrases, lines, they are presented in a variable order. So that is hyperpoetry. So here are examples of hyperpoetry. So as you can see, hyperpoetry involves highly visuals. Sometimes we can read some sections of poems according to varying orders. So if you have noticed from the example given, hyperpoetry has its own images, movement, or other special effects. And also, it does not necessarily consist lines and stanzas compared to traditional poetry. So it is not that strict, and as long as that it has the visual form and related to hypertext, fiction, and visual arts. So we are already done with knowing the definition of hyperpoetry. So now let's get to know the similarities and differences between traditional poetry and hyperpoetry. So first, let's have the similarities. So first, both poetry and hyperpoetry are two forms of literature. So the poetry is a traditional form of literature, while the hyperpoetry is an electronic literature that incorporates the use of computer. So next, both of them act as a powerful mediums through which the poets express strong emotions and feelings. So both are the powerful tool to communicate to the audience, of course, as they evoke emotions and feelings. So that is why every time we read poetry, there is an emotional response. So we get a touch, or either we feel sad, we feel happy, or any other feelings that we get from the poem. So remember that hyperpoetry still appears with verse, although it does not have strict lines, or it has written, or as long as that it is written to share ideas, express emotion, and create imagination rather. So next, both poets are capable of handling languages, images, and sounds in such a way that even the ideas are difficult to convey, they are skillfully communicated by them. So both poetries, they uses words to express their meanings to convey to the audience. So both of them are written by and done by the poets, which are skillful in handling the languages, the images, and sound in such a way that it makes the reader think critically to understand what they are writing or what they are trying to convey. So both may adhere to the use of imagery, metaphors, similes, and other figurative language to make the poem more creative. And last, both traditional poetry and hyperpoetry may not have meter, rhyme, and rhythm. So just like what I have mentioned a while ago, hyperpoetry consists of words, but it does not necessarily mean that it should have been in stanza or line. So it is not strict, and it comes in a form and it also comes in a form of traditional poetry, which we have this type of form that doesn't have restrict, or that is not restricted in terms of lines, meters, and stanzas. For example, the blank verse. And also we have the kind of poem that has meters, rhyme, and rhythm. So this also goes with traditional poetry. So that is for their similarities. So now, let's get to know the differences between these two. So first, let's have their definition. So poetry is a literature that uses aesthetic and often rhythmic qualities of language. So poetry, it is a kind of written expression that uses vivid expression of thoughts and emotions via the use of rhythm and in a unique style. So poetry, as we know, it has its own strategies, style, forms, and also a variety of languages and cultural traditions. So traditional poetry is more precise compared to other poetry. So the poets, they are expected to adhere to the certain conventions while writing sonnets, odes, blank verse, ballads, and dramatic monologues. So while the hyperpoetry, it is a digital poetry that is available on web pages and uses hyperlinks. So the hyperpoetry, it involves or it incorporates movements and images, so as well as connections to sub-poems or footnotes. So the visual elements plays a very significant role in hyperpoetry, and the poem may have sections that may be read in variety of sequences. So poetry published in the form of hypertext on the web, it is known as the hyperpoetry. So, and it is refers to the verses that could not be presented with the use of computer. And in most cases, hyperpoetry is very focused in visual form. So compared to traditional poetry, which is focused on the forms. So while the traditional poetry is focused on its visual. Next is their medium. So traditional poetry is created using a paper-based medium, while the hyperpoets produce hyperpoetry using the computer as their medium. So this is the main difference between these two. So remember that the traditional poetry is a paper-based, while hyperpoetry is the digital medium. So hyperpoetry, it involves, or it focuses primarily on images, while the poetry, it is a oral and written form that is composed using rhythmical words to express experience or imagination in a beautiful way. So it is more creative in words. So while the hyperpoetry is creative in images, or and creative and visual. Next is the reader imagination. So traditional poets handle their language in such a way that it evokes readers' imagination to create a visual and other imagery in the reader's mind. So the reader's imagination is wide. So while the hyperpoetry, it only involves the lines of verses that appears with link to footnotes, sub-poems, poetry generators, and poetry with images or movement. So the reader's imagination is narrow. So why is it so? So poetry, it is characterized by its refusal to be defined on their own arm, which perhaps the quality that is most essential to the definition of poetry. So the traditional poetry is like a canva or a paint paletted all over a canva, and the audience will read it and understand it on their way, because there is no exact definition. While on the other hand, the hyperpoetry is shaped and focused, so that is why it is narrowed, because it has already its visual design, which makes the reader think that the definition will only focus on that, and Aside from it, it is marked up by the hypertext, wherein the reader will click until they reach the end. So the information or the idea that they get from the poem is limited. In conclusion, we can simply say that the main difference between hyperpoetry and traditional poetry is their medium. So poets basically produce traditional poetry using paper, while the hyperpoets produce hyperpoetry using the computer. So compared to hyperpoetry, which involves the use of images and movements, the traditional poetry has the capacity to boost the reader's imagination and power of critical thinking. So that will be the end of our discussion for today. So for your activity, you are tasked to create your own hyperpoetry. So thank you for listening. Have a good day.